Hello and welcome to the show. I am Joe Topat. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles has had a long and varied history. Since their introduction in 1984, several interpretations of these characters have popped up. These can range anywhere from the grim and gritty, like the original comics, to the just plain stupid, like Turtle Tunes. Despite the many adaptations the Turtles have gotten over the years, there is still one thing everyone thinks of when they hear the name Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: the original cartoon from 1987. Produced by Fred Wolf, there is no question that if it weren't for this show, the name Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles wouldn't be the cultural phenomenon it is today. Yet for some people, it's an embarrassment to the legacy of TMNT. Like Batman, the Turtles went from serious to goofy to serious again. Some critics have viewed the cartoon as simply a half-hour commercial for the toys. Others have said it was good for its time, but it hasn't aged well. I disagree with either sentiment. In today's video, I'm going to go over the 1987 show and how different it is to its comic book counterpart. So without further ado, let's begin. After the unexpected success of the comics, creators Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird began to look for ways to expand their turtle empire. In 1986, Playmate took an interest in producing toys of the Turtles. There was just one tiny problem. The comics were in no way kid-friendly. The Turtles cursed, drank beer, and they weren't afraid to kill. They killed Shredder in the first issue, for crying out loud. Since this was the 1980s, it was decided that the best way to sell the toys was to make a kid-friendly cartoon. This meant that several changes needed to be made. The first change was with how the characters from the comics were portrayed, starting with the Turtles themselves. Perhaps the biggest change made on the Turtles was the color of their mask. All four of them wore red in the original comics. It was decided that each would have their own color to tell them apart: blue for Leonardo, purple for Donatello, red for Raphael, and orange for Michelangelo. This was actually a brilliant idea. Having read the original comics, it was impossible to tell the turtles apart when they weren't holding their weapons. Their personalities were kind of the same from the comics, with some changes, of course. Leonardo obviously is the leader of the group. Donatello is the resident genius. Raphael is perhaps the most different from his comic book counterpart, for he is portrayed as sarcastic rather than a hothead. Michelangelo, of course, is the party animal. The show would give him the catchphrase Cowabunga, which, as far as I know, he never said in the comics. The Turtles were shown to have a love for cheesy sci-fi movies, which is fitting since they could be characters from one. They often went out in public wearing disguises. Usually they wore hat and trench coats. The cartoon also added their obsession with pizza. They were always eating some bizarre toppings. Splinter, though, hated pizza. Speaking of Splinter, it was decided that they would combine the character of Hamato Yoshi. Originally, Hamato Yoshi was killed by Oroku Saki. Splinter was his pet rat, who trained the turtles to kill Oroku Saki, or the Shredder, to avenge his master. In the cartoon, Hamato Yoshi was framed by Oroku Saki for trying to kill the master of the Foot Clan. So he was thrown out and went to New York. He would become a rat as a result of the mutagen. There was one episode called Splinter No More, where Splinter became human again, but found that he preferred being a rat after seeing how humans treat each other.
Once again, this was a brilliant change, as it kept the feud between Oroku Saki and Hamato Yoshi ongoing.
As I've said before, Shredder was killed in the first issue of the comics. Peter Laird has admitted in interviews that neither he nor Kevin Eastman considered Shredder to be important beyond serving as part of the Turtles' origin. They didn't really want the Turtles to have a main adversary. The cartoon changed that. Most of the early episodes involved Shredder in some way. Even though he tried to rule the world, Shredder always made destroying the Turtles and Splinter his top priority. He often acted like a whiny child. There was even an episode where he turned into a child. But he was still a fierce fighter. He could actually beat all four turtles in a fight. That's something the original couldn't claim.
I'll also give the show credit for actually giving Shredder a personality.
The foot soldiers were originally humans in the comics. They were made into robots so that the turtles could break them without hurting anyone. Another bad guy from the comics to make it into the show was Baxter Stockman. The most obvious change was that they made him white for the show instead of black in the comics.
I've never been able to find a reason why that change was made.
Like in the comics, he is the inventor of the Mousers. Also, both versions of Baxter have a huge ego. Though the cartoon Baxter was kind of stupid, he also works for Shredder. Perhaps the thing everyone remembers most about Baxter is the fact that he was turned into a fly. This was based off the 1986 remake The Fly, starring Jeff Goldblum. In the original comics, Baxter became a cyborg.
You know, this cartoon has the most sympathetic interpretation of Baxter.
He doesn't start off as a bad guy. He was just a scientist trying to sell his mousers. He had no idea that Shredder was evil. Then Baxter gets arrested and sent to the loony bin because of his stories of giant turtles. He later teams up with Shredder only to face execution because of one too many failures. Gets turned into a fly, then is sent off to Limbo, where his only friend was a computer.
For a show mostly known for its humor, that's pretty dark.
Although Baxter has no love for the turtles, most of his hatred is directed at Shredder. Most of his schemes involve getting back at Shredder in some way. Up next is Leatherhead. Leatherhead in the comics was a sympathetic character with a complicated relationship with the turtles. The cartoon made him into a villain who spoke with a heavy Cajun accent and carried around lobsters as weapons. The Rat King, who was a minor character in the comics, was given a recurring role in the show. He was even the first villain the Turtles fought who wasn't Shredder. The show also featured the Triceratons, but they only appeared in one episode in season 7.
April O'Neil, the Turtles' main human friend, was given a career change.
In the comics, she worked as Baxter's assistant before running an antique store. The writers wanted a way for the Turtles to be given information on the outside world. Taking inspiration from Lois Lane, they made April into a TV reporter for Channel 6 News. Like Lois, April will do anything to get a story. Also, like Lois, this often caused her to get captured, becoming one of the show's run-on gags. The only connection that April had to her science background from the comics is her jumpsuit. She wore one when she worked for Baxter, though it was blue rather than yellow. April would keep the yellow jumpsuit until season 8. Her outfit was changed because one of the new producers thought a reporter would never wear a yellow jumpsuit when reporting.
Even though I agree with the guy, her original outfit was a lot more memorable.
Whenever April needed the turtles, she would contact them with a turtle com. It was basically a cell phone with video. The final character from the comics to be featured in the show is Casey Jones, and boy did he get the shaft. Although he played a major role in the comics and later adaptations, Casey only appeared in 5 episodes of the show. They never explored his relationship with April or his friendship with Raphael. He was basically shown to be a Dirty Harry type character. Casey had a strong sense of justice, maybe a little too strong. This guy didn't care if you were a bank robber or a jaywalker. He'd beat you up if you were a lawbreaker. Casey was always fun to see. It was hilarious how seriously he took even the smallest example of lawbreaking. I also thought it was funny how he never took off his hockey mask, even when he was undercover. As funny as he was, it was still disappointing that he wasn't used more. It would have been funny to see Casey and April go out on a date at a fancy restaurant and have him wear his hockey mask. The jokes practically write themselves.
Now that I've gone over the characters from the comics, time to go over the ones created for this show, starting with Krang.
Out of all the new characters, Krang is the only one who sort of has a comic book counterpart. You see, in the original comics, there was a race of aliens called the Utroms, who, as you might have guessed, are brain-like aliens who have robot bodies. Unlike Krang, they aren't evil. Krang technically isn't an Utrom, for he did have a body that he lost when he was banished. The episode Invasion of the Krangzoids established that he looked like a giant lizard. Krang was a warlord from Dimension X. He has rock soldiers or stone warriors on his side. He is the one who provides Shredder with technology like the Technodrome, the robot foot soldiers, mutagen, and whatever Shredder needs. People often describe the relationship between Shredder and Krang as an old married couple, and I have to agree. The two of them are always arguing over their evil plans. Shredder was always more focused on destroying the Turtles and Splinter, while Krang was more interested in conquest. Krang rarely gets personally involved in missions, preferring to send Shredder to do the dirty work. Shredder often complains about this, which gets on Krang's nerves.
Though Krang does love to troll Shredder.
In one episode, he had Shredder and Baxter go on a garbage boat. According to Krang, it was where the signal for the transdimensional portal was the strongest. Shredder assumes Krang just did it to annoy him. His suspicions are confirmed when Krang asked How's the air? The mutagen Krang provides gave the show a lot of different mutants. The most important ones, beyond the Turtles and Splinter, would be Bebop and Rocksteady. They were originally humans who were part of a gang. They were the ones who chased April into the sewers where she met the Turtles in the first place. Bebop and Rocksteady would later volunteer to become mutants in order to get revenge on the Turtles. Although they were bigger and stronger, they still weren't too smart.
Although Bebop and Rocksteady are known for being total idiots, they didn't start off that way.
They were never smart, but in the first season, they were still rather intimidating. Rocksteady at one point told April to stop filming them or else he'll make her eat the camera. It was decided in the second season that Bebop and Rocksteady would become the lovable morons we know them today.
I honestly think making them dumber was a big improvement.
In the first season, they just felt like generic henchmen. Sure, it was cool that they were a mutant rhino and warthog, but you could replace them with anyone and you'd never miss them. Once they became total screw-ups, they became interesting. When I was a kid, I could never get enough of their antics. Even as an adult, I still find them funny. If Krang and Shredder are like an old married couple, Bebop and Rocksteady are their dim-witted sons. Together, they were comedy gold. There were a lot of other villains, usually a mad scientist or a 1940s gangster. Perhaps the most infamous one would be Don Fratelli. He's pretty popular among a certain group of people. For the good guys, there were the folks at Channel 6. The boss is Bern Thompson. He's basically like Perry White or J. Jonah Jameson, though Jameson might be a more accurate description, for he had a hatred for the Turtles as the series went on. At first he didn't seem to hate them too much, but as the show went on, he would blame them for everything. Although he and April butted heads over news stories, especially when it came to the Turtles, Byrne did seem to value her as a top reporter. Then there's Vernon Fenwick. He would often be seen working the camera for April, but most of the time he tried to scoop her. While April is fearless when it comes to getting a story, Vernon is a big coward. He would prefer to cover stories that are safe and let April do the dangerous ones. Vernon was another character I couldn't get enough of. I always loved how he acted like he was better than April, yet jumped every time somebody said boo. The final member of the Channel 6 family is Irma. She's the man-hungry receptionist and April's friend. I admit I didn't really care for her as a kid. I found her obsession with wanting a man annoying. Now that I'm older, I find her hilarious, mostly because I have since met girls who acted like Irma. I also love her sarcasm. Other characters worth mentioning would be the punk frogs from the Everglades. They were basically more laid-back versions of the turtles. Mondo Gecko, who was with the turtles when they mutated, only to be taken to be raised by a bad guy. He'd later turn out to be a good guy. Bugman, Michelangelo's comic book hero. The Neutrinos, fun-loving teens from Dimension X. Kala, one of the neutrinos, is Michelangelo's girlfriend. Then there's Zack. He's what they call the fifth turtle. Zack is just some kid who hangs out with the turtles. I never really cared for him. It always felt like he was thrown in by some focus group to give kids someone they can relate to. Thankfully, the show never used him too much. One episode called The Great Boldini featured his friend Caitlin. She was only in this episode and was pretty forgettable. The most significant of these lesser characters would be Lotus. She was a female ninja Krang hired. Lotus was a tough ninja who formed a bond with Leonardo, though her code of honor wouldn't allow her to join the side of the turtles. Lotus would serve as a precursor to Karai, who would make her first appearance in the comics in 1992, 3 years after Lotus. Although I'm not sure if Lotus was a direct inspiration for Karai, there are too many similarities for it to be a coincidence.
Now for the voice actors.
The show featured a lot of talented voice actors. Cam Clark voiced Leonardo in Rocksteady. Barry Gordon voiced Donatello in Bebop. Rob Paulson voiced Raphael. Townsend Coleman voiced Michelangelo. Peter Renaday voiced Splinter and Vernon. Renee Jacobs voiced April. Cam Clark's cousin Pat Frawley voiced Krang, Baxter, and Casey. And James Avery, who played Uncle Phil on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, voiced Shredder. A strange rule the show had was that all actors had to record their voices together. This was both a good and bad idea. On the one hand, this allowed the actors to play off each other. They would always ad-lib jokes, many of which made it into the episodes. On the other hand, certain actors aren't always able to make it to recording sessions. Most cartoons would just record the actor's voice later. Not this show. They actually had backup actors ready to fill in.
I don't know of any other cartoon that had that rule.
Honestly, I wish the producers would have just allowed the actors to record their voices whenever they could. It was always jarring to hear a different actor's voice come out of the characters in certain episodes. This show has a reputation of turning the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles goofy, but it didn't start off that way. The first season was a 5-part story arc that covered the Turtles' origin and how they met April, Shredder, and Krang. Despite the many changes they made from the comics, the first season was able to retain the grim and gritty tone, at least as close as they could for the time. Starting with the second season, it was decided that the show would have a goofier tone. Part of this was due to network interference, and part of it was due to the actors constantly ad-libbing jokes. The characters would constantly break the fourth wall. For the most part, the show was episodic, though they would occasionally do callbacks to previous episodes. This was usually done when the characters would break the fourth wall. One of the few ongoing stories they had was the Technodrome ending up in some different location, like Dimension X, the Earth's core, the Arctic, and the bottom of the ocean. Krang and Shredder would often come up with schemes to get the Technodrome unstuck. The show had a sub-season where the Turtles and Splinter go on a European vacation. These were pretty fun episodes to watch, as it allowed the characters to travel in different countries.
Even though this cartoon was a lot tamer than the original Mirage comics, it still faced censorship.
In the UK, the show was called Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, because I guess the word ninja is too violent. It's a silly change, but not too big of a deal. It just means it has a different title in the UK. The second case of censorship left a huge impact on the show for all countries of the world. As you know, the turtles each have their own weapons. Leonardo has katana, Donatello has a bow, Raphael has sai, and Michelangelo has nunchucks. There's the problem. Nunchucks are banned in certain countries. So in order to appease these countries, the producers decided to eliminate Michelangelo's nunchucks and gave him a grappling hook. He would keep it for the rest of the series.
So, katanas and sais are okay, but nunchucks aren't? I'll never understand that line of thinking.
Couldn't they have just given him a different weapon? I get that anything could be used as a weapon, but some are better than others. How effective can a grappling hook be as a weapon? Anyway, in season 4 they started featuring the characters in PSAs called Turtle Tips. Most of them deal with the environment. I know some people make fun of these PSAs, but I don't see anything wrong with Turtle Tips. While rewatching the show, I noticed it started to take itself a little more seriously in season 6. They still did goofy stuff, but the tone was different. Then along came season 8. This is when it became known as the Red Sky episodes. Due to the red sky, no longer were the turtles or their enemies goofy. April started to work as a freelance reporter after the destruction of the Channel 6 building, so we basically never see Byrne, Vernon, and Irma again. A new villain was added named Lord Dreg, an alien warlord from Dimension X. Somehow he was able to convince the world he's a good guy and the turtles are the bad guys. I'd question the logic of trusting a guy who looks as evil as Lord Dreg and why the public would hate the turtles after all the good they did, but then I remembered the kind of world we live in. He eventually gets exposed in the end for the bad guy he is. The turtles have a new ally named Carter. He's just some guy who gets exposed to mutagen and becomes like the Hulk. It just happens at random. In fact, the turtles have the same problem. They eventually get it under control, but it takes a while.
This is going to be an unpopular opinion, but I never did like the Red Sky episodes.
A lot of people love them because they were darker and more serious, but that's the reason why I hate them. I've always loved the goofy nature of the show. It's one of the reasons why I watched it. Even today, I still find it a fun show. Once it started to take itself seriously, it wasn't fun anymore. I'm not against a more serious version of the Turtles. I've seen the first live action movie, the 2003 cartoon, and read the original comics. All of them are really good. It's just that the 80s cartoon is my first exposure to TMNT, and for the most part, it didn't take itself seriously. I've heard a lot of people claim that the show was only good in season 1, 8, 9, and 10. I don't agree with that. Seasons 2 through 7 are still worth seeing. Sure, they can be silly, but they never were as silly as Turtle Tunes. Also, I never did like Lord Dreg or Carter. Neither were really that interesting. I would have preferred Casey Jones given a bigger role instead of adding Carter. It's the same issue I have with that pizza guy in Secret of the Ooze.
Some fans, like myself, love this show, while others don't. What do the creators of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles think? I'll share with you two quotes from them.
Kevin Eastman once said in a 1998 interview with the Comics Journal, "The resolution at the end of the day, even when Pete and I both agree that, well, there's some stuff we really don't like, and some stuff that we wish we hadn't said yes to, stuff that they wanted to do, but we said we'll always have our black and white comics to tell the kind of stories we want to tell."
In other words, there were things about it he didn't like, but he's okay with it.
Peter Laird, on the other hand, said in 2012 on his blog, "Had I, again, speaking solely for myself and not for Kevin, been making the key creative decisions for the first animated series, it would have been very different. Among other things, there would likely have been no moronic henchmen like Bebop and Rocksteady. The Shredder would have been seriously malevolent. April would not have been a reporter and constantly need to be rescued by the Turtles. The Turtles would not have been so ridiculously obsessed with pizza, and the Shredder would not have had one of his businesses, a restaurant called Ninja Pizza, and the show would not have had a joke or a gag every 5 seconds."
In other words, he hated it.
Over the years, Eastman seems to embrace the popularity of the show. He's worked on the 2012 cartoon and the IDW comics, each of which takes inspiration from the 80s cartoon. While I don't think he likes every interpretation of the Turtles, Eastman remains very open to new interpretations. Laird, on the other hand, has never been shy about his hatred for the show. In the 2003 cartoon, which, by the way, he had more control over, the 80s show was occasionally referenced and mocked. Michelangelo's catchphrase, "Cowabunga," and April's yellow jumpsuit were treated like huge embarrassments. Then came Turtles Forever, the crossover movie that reduced the 80s Turtles as goofy caricatures.
Was the 80s cartoon made to sell toys? Yes. Was it goofier than the comics? Yes. But I don't see how that makes it bad.
The characters were a lot of fun, and the show never got too ridiculous. There's a charm to this old show that's very hard to top. It added so many important elements to the Turtles that we associate with them to this day. Will everyone like it? No, but that's okay. There have been many interpretations of the Turtles since this show first aired, and there will be many more in the future. Every fan will have their own favorite. For me, the 80s show will always be my favorite.
Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think. And don't forget to like and subscribe. See ya later.